Brazen.
I'm Bradley Hope, and I'm here with Tom Wright. We're just going to check in on the Fat Leonard case. There's been some news yesterday, and obviously we had the big podcast last year where we heard from Leonard himself for the first time, and this was the first court case to come out since the podcast. And obviously the podcast itself featured heavily in the actual trial. So I thought I'd just check in to see, Tom, what happened yesterday and sort of what does it mean for this case?
Well, the jury reached a verdict in the case of 5 Navy officers who were involved with Leonard, and they found 4 of the 5 guilty and were hung on the 5th officer, who's actually an admiral. This is the first time that the Fat Leonard story has gone to court in any way, because other Navy officers who were involved with Leonard pleaded guilty, and so their cases never went to court. So this year we've been hearing much more about Fat Leonard in a courtroom than ever before. It's not a surprise, to be honest, that 4 of the 5 were found guilty, and they'll be sentenced later. We don't really know exactly why the admiral in the case, why the jury was unable to, why the jury was hung in his case. And I think we'll find out a little bit more about that as time goes on, that nothing really came out of the court yesterday. What this really means now is that Fat Leonard himself can go ahead for sentencing. He pleaded guilty 7 years ago now and was supposed to be a star witness in the cases of these 5 Navy officers. And we're now hearing that he will be sentenced sometime in the middle of July.
And what's the kind of general scoreboard in this case so far? I mean, how many people have pled guilty? How many convictions do we have? What's the kind of overall effect of this case so far?
Well, there's been a couple of dozen Navy officers who've pleaded guilty, and some of them have been sentenced. Some of them, like Michael Mashevitz, who went to one of the first people to go to jail, has already come out of jail, I believe. So some people have already served their time. This has been going on for so long. But because these 5 pleaded not guilty, the government was hoping that they would change their pleas to guilty. I mean, there was about 8 or 9 of them to start with, and a number of them changed their pleas to guilty. So these were the only ones left. And so I think the Navy now is going to be hoping that they can draw a line under this terribly embarrassing set of events. However, the podcast, the fact that Leonard talked so openly in the podcast about how he, in his view, corrupted admirals who weren't sanctioned, means that, myself and lots of other people think, well, the justice hasn't really been served in this case, just because it didn't, the highest ranks of the Navy, the 4-star admirals that were involved with Leonard, they were not sanctioned.
And obviously, you went through all the kind of gruesome details of this case in the podcast. Was there additional details like that came out during the trial? I mean, did they hear from any kind of interesting characters about all of this corruption and sort of, going crazy with prostitutes and having parties and stuff like that?
Well, it wasn't that there was any more detail, but what happened was, because Leonard decided to talk for our podcast, we smuggled a microphone to him in his detention. He's got kidney cancer, and he was allowed out of jail for home arrest. We were able to smuggle a microphone, just like the one I'm talking on now, to him, and we were able to record over 20 hours of audio with him. Because of that, the prosecution, he was supposed to be the star witness because he's pleaded guilty. He was supposed to be the star witness in the cases of these 5 officers who pleaded not guilty. The government decided to pull him from the stand. And I think that's because, they were worried that the defense counsel would try to impeach him, try to discredit him because of his decision to talk for the podcast. The defense counsel for those officers, they subpoenaed the raw tapes of my interviews with Leonard and read them out during court, in fact, trying to discredit Leonard. I actually believe they took some of those tapes out of context, but they tried to show that Leonard was not a reliable witness. So the government didn't call him to the stand anyway. And that meant that they were relying mainly on emails, these emails in which the Navy officers discussed getting prostitutes or gifts for their wives or Michelin star dinners in return for sort of moving aircraft carriers and submarines, nuclear-powered submarines into ports that Leonard controlled, so he could sort of build the Navy for tens of millions of dollars. So Yeah, we did get some details, some reading outs of some of those emails, but all of that stuff was already in the indictments. No television cameras were allowed inside the courtroom. I mean, one of the big issues here is this is one of the worst national security failures in U.S. military history, but no one can feel like they really can get that close to the story because all of this happened behind closed doors.
Well, I think we talked about justice and whether it's being served, and obviously there's some question over whether or not the higher ranking officers were held to account. One of the things that really stuck with me in the podcast was the story of the mother of two of Fat Leonard's children and how she had been separated from her children since they were toddlers and hadn't seen them in close to a decade. Have you heard anything more about that? Is there any other of those kind of bits and pieces that haven't been resolved? I mean, have you heard any news on those?
Yeah, one of the big themes of the podcast is the sort of abiding misogyny in the Navy. Leonard talks about how he would be used to get officers and enlisted men out of trouble when their ships came into port, and they were like groping women, and there was cases against him with the local police, and he would go in and sort those kinds of things out. Obviously, women are a currency in this story. They're bought. Prostitutes are bought for officers so that they can have a good time with them and then do things that enriched Leonard. So, there's this theme through the podcast. And one of the reasons, I mean, it's hard to see psychologically why Leonard would be as he is, but, he talks in the podcast about how his own father would bring home other women and beat his mother, lock his mother in the bathroom while he was having sex with other women in the family house. So Leonard himself has a very strange relationship with women. And, he talks very openly in the podcast about having multiple mistresses or girlfriends. I mean, he calls them mistresses. And, many different children with different women. And one of those women was a Filipino girlfriend. And Leonard basically abducted her children from her and ended up living with them in house arrest in San Diego. He was able to even while he was in jail, get them to come over and live with him in house arrest. So we talked to that woman for the podcast, and she's called Morena de Jesus, and told her for the first time where her children were. She wasn't really aware of that before we contacted her. She was living in Australia and working there. Since then, she has filed a legal case in San Diego trying to get her children back from Leonard. And we don't really know exactly what's happened since then because this is an ongoing legal matter. But yeah, I think she's hopeful to get custody of her children again. She hasn't seen them for 10 years. It's really a tragic story. They were toddlers when they left, and now they're, I think, 13 and 14 years old. So it's really such a tragic story.
Yeah, that was one of the most heartbreaking parts of the podcast, I thought. And then on a final note, we had news about turning Fat Leonard into a TV series. Do you want to give a little bit of more detail about that and what you think that's going to be, and how that will be taking the story in a different direction or showing different aspects of it?
Well, Project Brazen, along with our partners SK Global, who are the film studio behind Crazy Rich Asians, we're co-producing Fat Leonard, a limited TV series based on the podcast. We announced last week that we've hired Peter Chiarelli, who co-wrote Crazy Rich Asians, to write the screenplay for Fat Leonard. He's just arrived in Singapore, and I'm going to go see him this weekend. He's coming here for inspiration. I think today he went down to Leonard's old house on Nassim Road. I mean, Leonard lived in a $130 million mansion, and his only business was U.S. military business. So that makes you realize what a crazy and corrupt story this is. So Pete's been down there today getting inspiration for his screenplay. And yeah, he's going to be putting that together in short order. And, next year we'll be fully developing that into a TV series. So we're very excited.
Now, obviously, your first love in journalism was Joe Low, also from Penang. Leonard, turns out, also from Penang. I think, is this sort of a kind of a career focus for you, the disreputable men of Penang, or?
Yeah, well, it's funny because I'm actually working on a news story about it's an origin story of the DEA, the drug agency, which was set up in the 70s. And the main character in that's not actually from Penang, but his nickname was the Bearded Wonder of Penang. So yeah, you could say we're going for our third Penang related story. That's a crazy story. It's set mainly in Thailand and in New York, but that's another show that Project Brazen's working on that will come out in due course.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. And from now on, we're going to be using Project Brazen Originals, our feed, to run additional content about our shows and also just other material from our other work. We have our newsletter, Whale Hunting. We have another two newsletters we launched recently, Gateway, and about the drug world in Northern Europe, and the Brush Pass, which is about the shadowy world of intelligence. So hopefully we'll be having more of these sessions in the near future.
Can't wait.